imagine we've got some angle theta. d theta dt is a frequency omega, and if you integrate, then theta t equals omega t, and it just goes around and around and around with that frequency. So more interesting is to couple a bunch of these phase oscillators together. And so each one has its own frequency that may not be the same. And so how are they going to synchronize if they have different frequencies? So that's where this coupling term comes in. Imagine here's, say, theta I, and here's, say, theta j. Amplitude's irrelevant. Let's write this here, theta j. And this ODE here is going to tell me what's the influence of oscillator j on oscillator I. So if you think about it, the sine of theta j minus theta I, the way I drew them, is going to be the sine of this angle here, which is small positive angle, which is going to be positive. So when j is a little bit ahead of I, this is going to be a positive quantity, and I'm going to bump oscillator I a little bit faster as a result of the coupling. And you can draw different cases. If j is behind, it's going to retard I slightly, and really oscillator I is going to have a lot of different neighbors. This big Kij is going to be some kind of coupling matrix representing the network structure and what's the influence of each oscillator on each other oscillator, and somehow you couple them all together with your network structure. And this would tell you how to evolve the system over time. This system's been very well studied for different network geometries. If the oscillators are, for example, in a ring like this, I'm not going to draw them all, it's harder to synchronize them because the distance from here to here is so far. It takes a while for any information about this oscillator to propagate over to these on the opposite side. However, if we were to add just a very few, small number of long-range connections here, people would call that a small world network, and it becomes a lot easier to synchronize. So studies of synchronization show that if you make your network diameter, so to speak, smaller by adding a few long-range connections, you can synchronize more easily. And there's tons of other things known about synchronization. I can refer you to a nice review paper if you want. So that's an example of dynamics on a network. The network structure didn't change, it's whatever it is, but there's dynamics happening on it. Now I want to explain about adaptive networks, which is what I'm the most interested in studying. So suppose the nodes and links can both change in time. And in particular, let's suppose they do it as a feedback loop. So the state of my nodes affects the evolution of the network structure. And then the network structure is going to affect the evolution of the state of my nodes. And there are a lot of real-life examples where you can think this might happen. For example, think road networks. There's a city, there's another city. We notice that there's really good roads between, and so maybe a bunch of people decide they want to live in this city because it's nicer and they'll commute to that one for work. Okay, so our population increased here, and that's going to lead to more traffic on the roads. And then we have traffic jams, so we're going to widen the roads or make some new bypass or something, changing the network structure. And that's going to, again, affect how the population changes. And so we've got some kind of feedback loop going on. And you can imagine that sort of thing happening on the internet, where certain high traffic things need better hardware or more connections or whatever. Other technological networks can happen in neural networks because neurons can actually change the strength of their connections to other neurons. What's the name of this? Facilitation? Is that the word? Any neuroscience majors here? None. I can make up whatever word I want. Okay, so there are biological biological processes by which neurons can grow new connections, so they can change who they're connected to, but also more commonly they can change how strongly they're connected to other neurons. So you've got that change in network structure, which is going to affect the firing, but also the firing is what determines whether they want to strengthen or weaken the connection. And this is involved in learning and memory and things, or at least it's believed to be. So that's a big application of adaptive networks. The one we're most interested in talking about today is human social networks. So if you think about it, we'll use the example of a disease. Let's say your friend is sick. You might decide to cut off your social connection to that friend for a little while until he's healthy again. And maybe while you're not hanging out with him, you're going to hang out with somebody else instead. And so you can change your social connections in response to the disease state of the nodes in the social network. But then if we change our social connections, that's going to affect how the disease is going to spread. So your friend that you just ditched is less likely to spread the disease. You're less likely to get sick. And so we have a change in how the nodes are going to evolve as a result of this change in how the network structure is going to evolve. So I'm going to talk briefly about how you might model that situation. When we're thinking about, in this case, some kind of avoidance behavior. There's different ways that you can do avoidance behavior. You could just cut off your connections to your friends and stay home. Or you could change your connections to somebody different, some kind of rewiring process, all different options, and we've thought of various ones and modeled them. The first version that was modeled was rewiring of the network. 2006 was the first paper of this type. And so the mechanism was that non-infected people would rewire their connections away from infected people because those are the risky connections, and they would instead pick non-infected neighbors because those are safe. And plus, if you just rewire all of the connections, the number of links in the network is conserved and it makes it a little bit easier. So here's a schematic of how susceptible connected to an infected is going to rewire their connection. And the disease dynamics we're using is that it's an SIS model, susceptible, infected, susceptible. So susceptible gets infected. When they recover, they don't have any immunity. They go back immediately to being susceptible again to the disease. So this would be a disease you can catch multiple times rather than something like measles where you get it once and you have pretty much lifelong immunity. So this has been studied both by analytical techniques and also by just directly simulating these processes on networks. And because of the rewiring, the network structure is changing over time. So I'm going to give you a little quiz to see who's awake. Distribution of and distribution of degree u of degree. Okay. I need to write susceptibles in one of these blanks and infectives in the other blank. Which do you think is the susceptible degree distribution? Top one, bottom one.
It's infected, the bottom one, because didn't you say that as infected people get infected, all their friends take them?
Yes, yes, these are the pariahs and the outcasts. So, degree distribution is infected. The most probable degree is low. The average is low. Degree distribution of susceptible. The average degree is somewhere higher. And yes, we have simulated this and we've actually measured these and they look roughly like that. I didn't include it in the pictures, but that's roughly how they look. So, yeah, big changes in the network structure. If we didn't have an adaptive network, the infectives would actually have higher degree, not because being infected made them have higher degree, but simply because the high degree people, the hubs in the network, were at risk. And so they got sick more likely. And so we would see these sorts of things reversed if our network weren't doing this avoidance rewiring. So that's an effect on the network structure. There are also effects on the disease. I'm not going to go into the analysis. I'll just show you the results. So W is my rate for rewiring nodes, and I'm showing you 3 cases. Not rewiring the links at all, some moderate rate, and then some higher rate for rewiring the links. What happens is I'm going to plot the fraction infected versus the infection rate. And if the infection rate is really low, the disease dies out and we don't have any infection at the far left. If the infection rate is really high, the infection does propagate and we have high infected fraction at the far right. The interesting stuff is in between. So here in the static network, I'm going to draw a zoom in of this. Here in the static network, there's nothing, and then the disease starts to take off at some threshold infection rate. And the curve is going this way. We don't have any bending backward of this curve. However, once we put in enough rewiring, we get this region with 2 stable states. It could be either high disease level or it could be disease-free. And which of these states it goes to depends on the initial conditions. So that's an effect that doesn't exist in the static networks. It's a result of the avoidance rewiring. And similar stuff going on as you turn it up even higher, except you can maybe also get the infection level in the system to start to oscillate. So new dynamics happening. Let me quickly show you another social example because this is most related to one of the summer projects I'm going to mention. This is an adaptive network with opinion dynamics. Each node has an opinion. It only gets to have one. And there are 2 ways that we're going to evolve this system, 2 different transitions we're going to do. If you have a friend who disagrees with you, you can find a new friend whose opinion does agree. This isn't a physics journal, physical review E. This is not social commentary or anything. But yeah, you can find a new friend. So this node I disagreed with J. I found a new neighbor over here to connect to and dropped the friendship with J. The other thing we can do is, rather than changing the links, we can actually change people's opinions, or change the nodes. So I can, we're doing it the other way. J can convince I, so J and I are now in agreement because I picked up J's opinion. So those are the dynamics that are modeled here. And what it ends up doing is, after a very long time, you get some kind of consensus. Everybody agrees with their neighbors either because they convinced them or they drop the ones they disagree with. But what consensus state you get is going to depend on this phi, which determines are we mostly dropping our friends and finding new ones, or are we mostly convincing people. So in the case of everybody's convincing everybody else, we're going to have a big cluster, it didn't fragment, and they all agree. In the case of everybody's dropping their connections in favor of somebody who does agree, we're going to have a bunch of little clusters and some kind of phase transition between. So this brings me to what I want to say about summer projects. I've mentioned many possible applications of adaptive networks. The problem is there are actually no good data sets because these are kind of hard to collect. Real-time data on who you're friends with now versus who you're friends with next month, really, really hard to collect. But there's a lot of possibility for collecting this online. And so I have in mind to use an online message board as an example of an adaptive network. Rather than opinions, where you can have only one, you're Republican or Democrat or whatever, I'm imagining people have a set of interests, and you can pick up more interests without necessarily dropping the ones you have. And so you can pick up interests from your other friends on the message board, and maybe once you pick up the interests, it then changes who you're going to talk to, because you'll start talking to the other people interested in the same thing. And so we're hoping that we can actually see the network adapt over time. We have some ideas for how to analyze it to pick that out. And so the data collection is going to be programming a web crawler to go through these message boards and take data on who's talking to whom. So it's going to be some text processing sort of things. And then for modeling it, it should be a model for interest dynamics rather than opinion dynamics. So related to what I just talked about, but with a number of extensions because it's not quite the same as opinions. I mean, two people could have opposite opinions, but if they're both passionate about the same interest or same issue, we'd say they have the same interest, and so we'd put them together in the interest space. The other thing I have in mind, this is not necessarily an adaptive network, but it is online social networks. There is an organ donation nonprofit to promote people, to encourage people to sign up for being organ donors. And the director of the nonprofit is in Williamsburg, and he does a lot of his stuff by Facebook. And we could get access to see who's actually liking the Facebook page, who's sharing the statuses, that sort of thing. And it could be an